And we're live. Hello, YouTube, and welcome to my channel. I am here today with Reality Weasel. Reality Weasel has been making YouTube videos on his eponymous channel since May of 2016. His channel is dedicated to advocating for classical liberalism in every conceivable realm, historical, philosophical, and biological. Reality, glad to have you on the show.
I'm very excited to be here, Benedict.
Today we'll be discussing whether objective morality requires the existence of God. The format of the debate will proceed as follows. I will present my defense of the resolution, after which Reality will give his reasons for rejecting the resolution and responding to my defense. After these opening statements, we'll have an hour of open discussion, during which we'll take questions from the chat. Finally, we'll have closing statements. Before we begin, I want to remind viewers to check out the description below. You will see links to Reality Weasel's channel and Twitter, and my Patreon, Twitter, and Discord. Your support helps us continue to make content. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your support. With that out of the way, I'll begin my opening statement. In defending the resolution, objective moral norms can only exist if God does. It's important that I make clear what I'm not arguing. I'm not arguing that atheists cannot be moral. Reality Weasel and I both agree that reason can investigate nature, including human nature, discover order within it, and move human beings to act according to that order. An atheist can use reason to be moved by it just as well as theists can. This investigation of that natural order and the precepts for action derived from it that we call moral norms are what we might call the natural law. Furthermore, Reality Weasel and I both believe that by investigating human beings in this way, we discover that they have an intrinsic moral worth to which certain rights, including participation in the political order and protection from unjust coercion, are attached. Thus, Reality Weasel and I can both be classified as natural law classical liberals. Where our opinions diverge is that I do believe that the natural law can only be justified as a moral imperative in reference to a divine law, and therefore a divine lawgiver. In other words, we can know that human beings have intrinsic moral worth and are deserving of ethical consideration because they have reason. But the fact that human beings have reason is not what gives them intrinsic moral worth. This is an important distinction between moral epistemology and moral ontology. The fact that human nature is constituted a certain way does not by itself mean that human beings ought to act according to the way in which they are constituted. This is what the philosopher David Hume meant when he said, "You cannot derive an ought from an is." The fact that human beings are constituted to act and be treated a certain way according to their nature doesn't mean that they ought to do so. The order of being, what is, and the order of morality, what ought to be, are separated by a logical chasm requiring another premise to cross it. Several philosophers have recognized this problem. In Plato's Republic, Socrates finds the need for a noble lie. He says, people ought to be told that the earth is their mother, and they ought to regard other citizens as their brothers and children of the selfsame earth. It is from that noble lie of the common sonship of the people that Plato derives his ought. This may satisfy our practical needs, but if we want to claim that there is such a thing as an objective morality, we cannot do so by predicating it on a lie, no matter how noble. On the other side, we have philosophers like Nietzsche who argued that human nature was something to be overcome. Nietzsche believed that reasonable investigation of human nature could not tell us what is moral or immoral, because a human being could transcend his human nature and operate by new laws of his own making. He could become the Übermensch. The only response one can give to Nietzsche is that transcending human nature can never be seen as good, because it is human beings that are good. But that begs the question, why is it that human beings are intrinsically good? The Christian has the ready answer. Human beings are good because the same being that created the universe and human beings and gave them lordship over it, constituted human beings in such a way that they reflect the divine will with which the universe is ordered. The natural law rests upon this deep mythos. that a rational God has ordered both the universe and human nature to reflect his will. Thus, by investigating the nature of the universe, we are not merely rationalizing about what is, but in fact about the mind that has willed it to be in a particular way. To say it another way, human beings can derive an ought from an is only because what is first derived from an ought. The intrinsic worth of human beings is therefore grounded in an act of divine will for the good of human beings. Socrates' noble lie turns out to be an ennobling truth. In order to reject the resolution that objective moral norms can only exist if God does, Reality Weasel will have to show that it is possible to ground the intrinsic worth of human beings in something other than the divine. Failing to do that, there remain only two possibilities. Either objective morality has no grounding, or its grounding is to be found in the love of God. I turn the floor over to Reality Weasel for his opening remarks.
All right, thank you, Benedict. Here is my opening statement. I argue that we can identify objective moral norms without reference to God as defined by the Abrahamic faiths. My position is that human morality, much like the human mind itself, is a byproduct of roughly 200,000 years of evolution, and that objective moral standards can be discovered via metacognition of these behaviors. The evolution of morality begins with the behavior of reciprocal altruism, that is, acting for the benefit of someone else with the expectation that this benefit will be returned in kind at a later time. This expectation is easily enforced, as the human brain has exceptional facial recognition and memory retention, meaning that non-cooperative actors, that is, those who do not repay the kindness of altruism, will not receive those altruistic benefits a second time. Hence, altruism is the most evolutionarily advantageous interaction between two members of Homo sapiens, giving rise to our species status as a social animal. Humans rely on each other for the survival of the species as a whole. In a social species, cooperation is rewarded with cooperation, and non-cooperation is met with ostracism, not because non-cooperation is prescriptively an immoral end in itself, but because it threatens to tear a cooperative social fabric apart and jeopardize everyone else's survival. After 200,000 years of operating within this framework, social behavior has become so hardwired into our brains that we have internalized a very simple instinctual paradigm. Social behavior is good, antisocial behavior is bad. That which benefits others is good, that which detriments them is bad. Hence, the first principle of human morality is that human life has intrinsic worth and must be preserved. We inherently know not to murder, steal, or rape because it would violate the humanity of the victim. Here, I conclude, is where we find our objective moral standard without reference to God. There are several factors in this line of thought that help divorce morality from a necessary God. First, this framework allows us to distinguish between an is and an ought. While other naturalistic frameworks may state that any behavior in line with human nature is moral, for example, a social Darwinist or race realist perspective, starting with human worth as a first principle allows us to dismiss tribal violence, racism, and natural but undue aggression as immoral. Second, it allows us to exercise moral reasoning beyond prescriptive moral codes found in religious texts. Rather than deriving moral codes from a finite list of moral or immoral actions, for example, the Mosaic Law or the teachings of Christ, we can begin from a single standard that all other actions must meet in order to be considered moral. This does open the possibility for moral ambiguities, but even so, such situations are only ambiguous because they exist in tension between objective moral standards. Third, and finally, it grounds morality in an observable reality. While traditional Christian thought holds that good and evil are immutable states that human beings simply act out, I hold that abstractions of good and evil cannot make sense unless in reference to human action. A man is not wicked because he was born so, a man is wicked because his actions fail to meet the moral standard. All of these statements can be made and verified without reference to God, and I firmly believe that the evolutionary argument is the most viable paradigm for establishing an objective, secular moral code. And I'll turn the floor back over to Benedict.
Okay. Thanks, Reality Weasel. With that concludes opening statements, and we are we are going to move into the open discussion. So Reality Weasel and I will discuss our opening statements, respond to each other, and if you have questions in the chat, we'll try to spot them as quickly as we can and incorporate those into the discussion. So my first question to you is that it seems to me that you're grounding the ought from the is of evolutionary history, that human beings have found that cooperative actions have been beneficial, and because those cooperative actions have been beneficial, they ultimately lead to the kind of beings that develop a cooperative morality. It seems to me though that suppose, in a sense, it seems almost a consequentialist argument.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if a human being found that non-cooperative action did lead to greater benefit for himself, then evolutionary history aside, what is it about his actions that are objectively immoral?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? Is it what is... So if, say that an individual actor performed an action that was to his own benefit evolutionarily, but it detrimented someone else, then what is keeping that from being immoral? Is that your question?
Essentially.
Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna... Let's see. There's something I might have missed in my opening statement here. That I'm sensing a disconnect here. The ought is not necessarily grounded in the is. The ought is, I guess, grounded in what we in science would call an emergent property of the is. So I said that the morality of this kind of evolutionary behavior, this instinctual behavior, it rests on the idea that human life has intrinsic worth. This is this concept that we operate under, that human life has intrinsic worth, is an emergent property of our sociality. So, as I said in that video that you were responding to initially before we started this discussion, we have the capacity to recognize other humans as individuals, recognize them as members of our own species, and there is this internalization of, well, this would be painful for me, and therefore it will also be painful for this other member of my species. That's the ought, is to preserve the integrity of that other person you're interacting with.
Okay. I guess what I see there is the recognition that member is a member of my species. That seems to be the necessary leap in order to take, that because this member is a member of my species, he thinks and feels the same way I do.
Mm-hmm.
He is due moral consideration because I am due moral consideration.
Mm-hmm.
But what would you say to someone who, take the ethno-nationalists on the alt-right?
Mm-hmm.
Someone like them would argue that, in fact, evolutionarily, whites and blacks have different... I don't know if some of them might go as far as saying we're different species.
Mm-hmm.
But a number of them I don't think would go that far, and instead say that it's just beneficial evolutionarily, for us not to give moral consideration to people of other races. In a sense, what could you say to someone who takes that position?
Well, I said in my opening statement that we can dismiss tribal violence as immoral. We can. Okay, hold on. I'm gonna scrap that. Let's start from the beginning. Tribal violence, or just tribalistic thinking in general, the likes of which we see in alt-right, or generally speaking, race realist types. This is more or less a glitch of that evolutionary history that drives us to be social. So, for example, we offer moral consideration to members of our own kind of vicinity, of our own most proximal community, because they're the people we interact with on a day-to-day basis. So if, of course, I'm speaking in kind of a primitive lens. So this would apply to hunter-gatherer societies 200,000 years ago, not necessarily to us now, but for people you interact with on a day-to-day basis, they're the people who are going to be providing you with your bread and butter or your shelter or what have you. It would benefit us to be social with everyone, but the reality of human populations and human distribution across the planet kind of impedes that objective, or it impedes that possibility, because there are some populations that live too far away for us to be social with them, and so necessarily they develop different societies. They have different pillars of tribal unity. But I mean, the idea that these different communities are not worthy of moral consideration has nothing to do with kind of the intrinsic processes of genetics, rather there's nothing advantageous to us in an individual sense based on person-to-person interactions that would necessitate that we discriminate against people because they are from a different tribe or a different community. It's a glitch just based on the reality of geographic distribution. So when we can separate the is of tribal violence from the ought of moral consideration, we can dismiss tribal violence as immoral because it doesn't fall under that framework of social behavior equals good and antisocial behavior equals bad.
Well, I would agree with you that it wouldn't necessitate violence towards a certain tribe, but I think the benchmark is, would it tell us that violence against this tribe is morally wrong? In other words, for example, we could imagine one tribe enslaving another tribe and justifying it on the fact that it would be evolutionarily advantageous for members of the members of that tribe. The slave labor will make a better world for their children. You could even some would even go as far as saying that by reducing the inferior gene pool of the other tribe, and talking about primitive cultures, gene pool seems kind of anachronistic, but we could imagine a tribe saying, we're going to slaughter the women of this other tribe because they have loose morals, and it's going to affect our children, and because they might intermarry with that tribe. So it seems like you could make evolutionary arguments for actions that at least we would consider immoral. So I guess what it comes down to is there a way of saying, no, that's not a real evolutionary argument, or is it something that or if it is, then does that mean that if evolution is the ground on which objective morality rests, that those are in fact moral actions? or I should say morally allowable actions.
Hold on, give me a minute here. That's a good one. I have to give you that. No, but as I said, there's nothing intrinsic to our genetic motivations because remember the primary biological motive for every biological system is to reproduce, right? Like every action we do, whether we know it or not, is in order to further that goal or to get closer to that objective. So every, when you're hungry, it's so you can survive and reproduce at a later date, right? It's your body telling you that you need to eat something or else you're going to die. There's nothing in our, so we're not consciously thinking about the gene pool per se. What the argument I'm trying to get across is there's nothing inherent in that primary motivation to survive that would necessitate that we enact violence or that we discriminate in any way against members of the other tribe. And as some of the arguments you laid out, oh well, we should reduce the gene pool of tribe X because they'll intermarry with our tribe and beget lesser genetically inferior children. That itself rests on the presumption that still that human life has intrinsic worth, right? That we want to benefit others to the greatest degree possible, or we want to benefit our tribe to the greatest degree possible. That seems to be the primary motivation in all of this moral reasoning, whether it enacts tribal violence or not. So I don't know if I'm explaining myself that well. I feel like there's thoughts running through my head that I can't, and my speech is not quite catching up with that speed. But like, do you am I coming across all right?
Yeah, no, I think I understand your point. The one thing, what it seems to be saying is that objective. What you're saying is that objective morality isn't just whatever is allowed evolutionarily, but moral behavior is that which is required evolutionarily. In other words, because slavery, enslaving another tribe isn't required by the evolutionary imperative, then although you could imagine ethno-nationalists disagreeing with that, their whole idea of whites being genocided. But even if we were to lay that argument aside and say that enslaving another tribe or another people is not required evolutionarily by the evolutionary imperative, your argument is that objective morality is that which is required. But I mean that
Yes.
Sorry, first I should ask, did I understand your point well?
Yes, I think that's a fair summary. Yes.
Okay. I guess the tough question there for you is there seem to be a lot of actions that we aren't required by the evolutionary imperative that we do accept as moral actions. For example, it meant celibacy for the first one.
Mm-hmm.
We generally accept that someone who chooses to live a celibate life is living at least at, all other things being equal, at least as moral a life as someone who chooses to get married and have kids. If objective morality rests in this evolutionary imperative to do that which is required by the evolutionary imperative, it's hard to see any action that violates the evolutionary imperative any more than celibacy.
Right. Well, I was hoping you would bring that up because I actually don't consider sexual ethics to be lying within any kind of objective moral framework.
Interesting.
And I know that I figured you would bring this up at some point because you're, obviously you're Catholic and I don't share those biases. But, I don't see anything inherently morally wrong with, say, violating a sexual taboo or engaging in premarital sex, as long as it is not violating the humanity or the, well, okay, let's discard the term humanity because that's kind of a fraught term, but in the event that it's not violating the bodily integrity of another person or another another. Okay, hold on. Let me see. If it's not violating the bodily integrity of any non-involved or non-consenting individuals, then I don't consider it to be an immoral action, and therefore it falls out of that objective moral framework.
Right, but we're not talking about breaking a sexual taboo here. I mean, I obviously think sexual action outside of marriage is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But for the sake of this discussion, we can leave that aside. What I'm asking is celibacy, which I don't think there's anyone who thinks celibacy is inherently immoral. But it would seem that if evolution is the grounds on which we build our objective morality, then celibacy is kind of the action of stopping the evolutionary process. At least for that individual's line. Mm-hmm. Shouldn't that be considered immoral?
Well, I wouldn't say so because it's not necessarily antisocial, right? Like you can engage in a personally celibate life and still not impede anybody else's ability to reproduce. This is very different from, say, assault or murder or anything that violates the bodily integrity of others, because it is inherently a roadblock to that goal of reproduction, and it is a non-cooperative behavior, and that's how I'm defining my the paradigm of morality versus immorality. Is that as a general rule of thumb, it's basically a paradigm of social versus antisocial behavior, and I don't necessarily see anything inherently antisocial about choosing to be celibate.
Okay. So it's not necessarily that evolution directly defines objective morality, but you seem to be arguing that human beings evolved to have a certain kind of nature. That nature happens to be a social being, and therefore, mm-hmm. as social beings, we should act in a social way. Is that
that's I don't know if that's quite right, because I'm not saying that morality comes from aligning oneself with kind of a, well, I mean, I do believe that humans have an innate nature, which you outlined quite clearly in your opening statement, but I don't necessarily believe that aligning with that nature perfectly is the basis of our morality, or if that's not how we judge whether or not an action is moral or immoral. It's more about the impact that those actions have on those around us. And so I think that sums it up pretty well. Yeah.
Okay. We do have a couple questions in the chat. The first one is from the Catholic Knight. He says, I feel that this debate rests more on the issue of violent people not necessarily inherently restraining themselves by belief in God, when they wouldn't do so without a belief in God. So
is that to say rests more on the issue of violent people restraining themselves by belief in God? I'm not sure what the question is.
Well, it's a statement, but I guess the question being asked is, it seems to be that a lot of people would commit violent acts were it not for belief in God.
Mm-hmm.
But and so that being said, does that mean that there is at least a social imperative for belief in God? In other words, if sociability is a grounding for our human nature, or sorry, if sociability is a grounding for our objective morality, and our objective morality is to avoid violent actions, and we find that belief in God is one of the only ways to avoid violent actions, then is there some kind of moral imperative to believe in God, almost whether or not it's true or not?
I said, well, doesn't that imply that people only act morally out of fear of punitive recourse? Because I certainly don't believe that's true.
Well, it might not be fear of punitive recourse. It might be actually people saying, yes, there's certainly that aspect. I'm not going to punch this person because if I punch this person, I'll go to hell. That's a way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
But another way might be that by believing in God, I have a vision of the good, and I want to align myself with that good, and that good happens to preclude punching people for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think a weakness of this.
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
I was gonna say, while I think there may be some truth, kind of on a social level of this, I mean, we do see that in contexts where atheism becomes enforced, they have been violent regimes. Now, the debate as to whether it was because they were atheist regimes that they became violent regimes is a much bigger discussion. But even laying that aside, my problem with that argument is that it doesn't go to the heart of whether objective morality exists. It's merely saying that, practically speaking, it would be good socially to believe in God, whether or not God actually exists or not.
Well, it does sound like Socrates' noble lie.
Yeah, exactly.
Does it not? Yeah.
But it was a good question, and that's why I wanted to bring it up. We have another one from Doragoon01. There's no objective morality or definition of good, but there is objective definition of violence. And I think that is an important question, because if we don't have, in a sense, if our trying to think of a way to phrase this, because I don't think the way he phrased it, there's no objective morality or definition of good, because you do accept that there is an objective morality definition of good. You you just ground it through evolution rather than the way I ground it through God. But it does ask, is there an objective definition of violence? And I think where that question becomes interesting is, like you said, violence, human nature. You accept that there is such a thing as human nature, but you don't believe that it's necessary to kind of align oneself to it. Am I right?
I'm sorry, you cut out during that last statement. What did you say?
Sorry. You said that you believe that there is an objective human nature, but it's not necessary to align oneself to it.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. So could there be disagreement over what in fact constitutes violence or antisocial behavior if you have almost a fluid definition of human nature? For example, trying to come up with a good one. We could bring up divorce. Strikes me as one. From a certain understanding of human nature, divorce can be harmful to a person. It could be seen as an act of violence. The idea that two people become one, two flesh become one. Divorce kind of wrenches that apart. I mean, would you agree that some people could see that as violence? But if you don't have a grounding in something other than evolution, I would assume you would not see that as violence in the same way.
Well, no, I mean, no, personally, I wouldn't see it as violence in the same way. I think the way I would define violence is undue or unprovoked aggression, and I would further qualify that with that which damages or is intended to damage specifically the bodily integrity of the individual who is being victimized. I think the question, I mean, in Doragoon's original question, I think where there's a weakness here is that the question isn't necessarily can we have an objective definition of violence without an objective definition of good, but rather is violence in itself bad? Is it against the good? I think that's more the question that should be asked, and where our disagreements lie.
Okay.
Or, well, no, perhaps not. What did I just? Could you repeat back to me what I just said? I think I said something wrong.
I think you suggested that a possible disagreement between us might be that that violence is whether violence can be good or if it's necessarily inherently bad.
No, I wouldn't say that. I must have stated that wrong then. What was I going to say originally? Man, I just lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
Okay. Here's a question I have for you.
Sure.
Basically, it sounds like you have. I mean, you said if I understand you correctly, you said that basically objective good comes from our social nature.
Yes.
Okay. And because of that, antisocial actions like violence against one's nature, and we can leave questions of self-defense aside, but unjust violence would be morally wrong, which I would accept. What about cases of, say, antisocial neglect? If we have an objective nature, and that means that we have to, I mean, it means that kind of to be a good, fulfilled human being, that requires us to interact with that social nature. If someone's antisocial, is that in some sense morally wrong?
Well, yes, I would certainly say so, and I think the disconnect we're experiencing here is that you've said repeatedly that something is moral if it aligns with our social nature or because it interacts with our social nature, and something is bad because it goes against our social nature. And admittedly, I've said this multiple times in the stream, and I'm just realizing this now, but that itself is not the ground for the objective moral standard. The ground is that as you said in the very opening of this stream, the presumption that human life has inherent moral worth, and that's kind of where we started the conversation. It's just that social behavior validates that worth or respects that worth, and antisocial behavior violates that worth and that moral consideration.
But would that include antisocial behavior by, say, um, being a shut-in for reasons other than medical or psychological, choosing not to associate with anyone?
Okay, so you're confusing antisocial with asocial.
Okay,
So
would you?
asocial means you don't interact with anyone, and antisocial, right? So like in the DSM, antisocial personality disorder is another name for psychopathy.
Okay.
Which basically means you lack all capacity for empathy, and you lack all capacity to even consider other human beings with the moral respect that we would expect as a social species. So no, I wouldn't consider asocial behavior to be immoral. So for example, a shut-in or a recluse, I wouldn't consider them to be inherently immoral, because they're not aggressing against any other people or damaging their integrity or violating their humanity.
Okay, so it sounds like to violate, in a sense, you don't believe you can violate your own social nature, per se, or at least it only becomes morally wrong when you violate someone else's through antisocial acts.
Right, that's correct.
Okay. What? Yeah, I guess I'm trying to parse that, because it sounds at that point that are there ever grounds for antisocial behavior? And here we're bringing in what we set aside before, like questions of self defense or defense of another. Um,
Mhm.
are there times that I can legitimately choose to aggress another, perhaps in defense of my country? Um, thus seemingly violating that kind of moral imperative.
Well, I would say yes, and I'm sure there are other people. Right. I think at this point this is just a matter of personal philosophy or personal preference. But I would say yes. I'm not kind of an absolutist pacifist. But yeah, no, I would say that provided that your aggressor is acting unduly or unprovoked, or even supposedly provoked, I do think you have the right to defend yourself, and that this doesn't necessarily constitute a moral aggression, or rather a moral violation. I do believe there are some ethicists who would say otherwise. Um, but even then, the fact that these ambiguities exist, to me, is more evidence that uh these objective moral standards do exist, because the tension between uh is defending yourself from violence with violence ethically defensible. That still rests on the assumption that you're kind of weighing two objective moral statements, both of which are valid, and one needs to simply outweigh the other.
Okay. I'm trying to follow the chat.
Yeah.
But it seems like, so I guess a couple I guess the best way to kind of go through them is a couple people raised questions or statements that kind of flow together. So like Clement Downs said, I think violence is easier to define than good. And Doragoon said violence defined with aggression. So what's aggression? Is taxation aggression? Is not giving Gibbs aggression? Is denying society your social interaction and cooperation doing violence to society? So I think that would that would be a question that you might have touched on, but if you could go further in depth, can one do violence to another by some form of neglecting perhaps a social responsibility?
Well, what kind of social responsibility would that be? Because I mean, just on face value, I would say, for example, if you're a mother who neglects her child, is negligent in taking care of them and feeding them and providing with all their basic physical needs, yes, I would consider that an immoral action. But you're introducing this notion of social responsibility. So could you give an example of that?
I think one of the questions in the chat was taxation.
Taxation, sure.
Do we have a responsibility to, and maybe not even taxation, but say charitable giving? Do we have some sort of responsibility to do that? And is it, and if not, is it, is that some sort of violence by neglect against society?
That's a really good question. Oh man. Well, what's your take on that? Let me ask you that first, because I don't know if I have an answer.
So my take on it is that I'm not sure if I would call it violence, because I think violence would have to have a kind of a very specific term. But I do think it raises a question, because if I understand your argument correctly, it's social behavior. Well, kind of the sociability of human beings is kind of the grounding for objective morality, and that grounding is because we found kind of social behavior to be beneficial evolutionarily. But that social behavior isn't just to to avoid wrongful action, to avoid harmful action. Surely we must have found it evolutionarily helpful to help each other, to do some kind of charity. So it would. So if I understand your argument correctly, that would seem to say it's morally required to do some sort of charitable work.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair line of reasoning, and I would agree with that. I'm with you. I certainly wouldn't call it violence. And if I'm to follow my own beliefs to their logical conclusion, and I sincerely hold those beliefs, then yes, I would have to grant that it is an ethical imperative to engage in charitable giving.
Okay.
Yeah.
So kind of moving on to a different part of the argument, you and by the way, I feel like I feel like I'm almost interviewing. If you have questions for me or want to,
I know I actually really appreciate that, because truth is I'm not great doing things off the cuff, and I appreciate you really kind of moderating this discussion. It's a huge service to me and to the discussion as a whole.
Yeah, but if you want to jump in with a question for me, feel free. But
sure.
What I was curious about was, one thing you said in your opening statement, and also in your previous video that we mentioned, and again in our discussion, is that a lot of this argument seems to fall upon this intrinsic worth of human beings.
Right.
And I guess my question is, where is that for you something that we kind of have to assume, or is there kind of a justification for that intrinsic worth?
The intrinsic worth is, I mean, yes, it is something we have to assume, but I do think it has a grounding in our observable reality. Again, I think I might have said this earlier, but not maybe not communicated it properly. But the worth, the objective worth of human beings is kind of a staple of our evolved consciousness, right? It's that capacity for empathy that derives from our capacity for memory retention and facial recognition, where we recognize other members of our species, and we internalize that as just kind of this incontrovertible objective thing. And perhaps I can't reason or prove in abstraction that humans have inherent worth, but it does seem to be the framework that basically every human society operates under. And I mean, even if you look towards societies that we would consider morally abhorrent, like Saudi Arabia, those kinds of moral systems are predicated on this notion of takfir, which is to purge the unbeliever so that the social fabric of a pure Islamic society won't unravel and be subject to Allah's wrath, or to the barbarian hordes who destroyed it before. So there seems to be this primary imperative, or this primary motivation to protect a larger society or a larger aggregate of human life. Same thing in honor cultures in perhaps we could say Japan, or in the Black Sea area, or Eastern. Maybe not Eastern, but like along the Mediterranean coast. I know there's a lot of honor culture kind of ethos there. But the primary motivation seems to be that we need to protect our own, and that we need to kind of maximize the human flourishing of those around us. And to me, if everybody operates under that framework, I don't think there could be anything more objective than that.
Okay. So the intrinsic worth of human beings is not really a prescriptive statement for you. It's more of a descriptive one. In a sense, that's just how human beings are. Whether or not it's true or not, we treat
Right.
each other. Okay.
Yeah, that's fair to say.
Suppose hypothetically, and like you mentioned, you study biology, and so you probably know about whether this could even be evolutionarily possible. But suppose that in kind of a violent way of treating each other became happened to be more evolutionarily successful. Um, we could imagine a hypothetical world where, in fact, warring tribes ended up being, more evolutionarily successful. The human race came to be, what referred to the aggregate of all these warring tribes. Would that be, in such a hypothetical world, would you say that it would be, that there would not be an intrinsic worth of a human being?
So are you asking? Okay, let me make sure I have this straight. You're asking if, say, the norm of human behavior was tribal warfare, would this invalidate the idea that humans have intrinsic worth?
Right. In other words, does human worth exist whether or not human beings actually treat each other with human worth?
At face value, I would answer yes. And I'm realizing now that might contradict the statement I made earlier. Would
So
would
oh, go ahead.
well, I think the question is less. I think the issue is less. Does right? Okay. In my framework, human worth doesn't exist because we treat each other with human worth, but because we perceive each other as having human worth prima facie. Does that not gel with any of the previous statements I made, to your mind?
I think it does, but it does raise the question. If in a sense what you're saying is it's not that we treat each other; it's that we perceive each other as having human worth. And so it at that point it's the objective. If we accept that all human beings see each other with an intrinsic worth, then did this arrive evolutionarily? In other words, if there was, I mean, if we had our hypothetical world of warring tribes, would we say that these people perceive each other with human worth? And if they don't, then does that mean that they're wrong, or does it mean that in fact human beings don't have intrinsic worth because we don't perceive ourselves as having human worth?
Okay, I see. I think I understand your question. No, I would say that they're wrong, because remember, the first evolutionary motive is to treat people as though they have human worth, or to perceive other people as though they have human worth. So that's within our own tribe, right? And earlier I described tribal warfare and not perceiving members of other tribes as having moral worth, or being deserving of moral respect, as a glitch in that same process. So yes, I would say that, yeah, the motivation with which tribes wage warfare against each other is biologically misinformed, right? There's the biologist Brett Weinstein actually explains this very well, and much better than I. But he sums it up in this slogan: the same instinct that causes a mother to nurture her child is the same instinct that causes others to throw each other into gas chambers. So there's a lot of literature on this, and I don't know if I'm necessarily qualified to explain it all here. But that is more or less where I stand, is that in an example of tribal warfare being the norm, that kind of behavior would be incorrect. It would be biologically misinformed, or wrong, or poorly guided, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, I think that quote by Brett Weinstein actually hurts your argument more, because if it's the same biological imperative that that causes women to nurture their children and other people to throw other people into gas chambers, then it's not the fact that it's an evolutionarily learned behavior that makes it right or wrong.
Right.
Because if it was that, then we would either treat both as right or both as wrong, because they come from that same biological imperative. And yet, presumably, we recognize that throwing someone into a gas chamber is wrong, but a mother nurturing her child is right.
Mm-hmm. Right, but the okay, let's see. Give me a minute here. The imperative is not that we would throw each other into gas chambers instinctually. The imperative at first is that there would be the mother nurturing her child, and it's solely by the accident of geographic reality that that instinct turns into something perverted and something that will damage others.
Okay. So if I understand your argument, it's that essentially those behaviors that we today understand as moral and what you and I would consider objectively moral come from our evolutionary heritage, and then sometimes that we don't interpret kind of that evolutionary heritage correctly. Interpret might be the wrong term, but we act on it wrongly because of some external accident.
Right. That's correct.
Okay. I think I mean I think the argument makes sense, but I think it's kind of a tall order. Could we, is there absolutely no evolutionary imperative? Perhaps not imperative, but is there no evolutionary justification that people who have committed atrocities, whether things like genocide, like the Nazis or the communists, was there no biological reasoning for that?
So, what was there no biological reasoning for Nazism?
Well, obviously, you and I would say that there wasn't, at least in the sense that, well, actually, I guess, I mean, we would both say that that's objectively wrong. Where I think our disagreement lies is that one could imagine an evolutionary reasoning for committing atrocities. And to to move it off the Nazis, but we could imagine like during the Black Plague, some actions that were taken were like the burning of entire streets of houses with people still in them to help prevent the spread of the plague, whether or not it was effective. But and again, they probably didn't understand evolution the same way we do, but there is kind of that idea of whether or not this is right or wrong, we're doing it for the protection of our people, our species. So I mean, go ahead.
Right. Well, that that to me is more an indictment of the means to which you're willing to go to get to the end. I think my point, kind of where I'm starting with all of this, is that the end of benefiting our people or protecting our people or what have you, the end of maximizing human flourishing is that evolutionary imperative. The means, regardless of whether or not they follow that same or whether or not they interact with that same instinct, we can laud or condemn accordingly, to however we according to that goal of maximizing human flourishing. But I don't consider an indictment of the means necessarily an argument against the evolutionary perspective that we can kind of derive our objective moral standard through the end or according to the end. Does that make sense?
Possibly. If I understand you correctly, it almost sounds like you're I don't mean the term fuzzy logic
Mm-hmm.
in a bad way. What I mean is,
Sure.
it seems like you're recognizing that there in a way that perhaps I wouldn't, that perhaps there are some moral ambiguities where even if you take an action based on a biological imperative, and this action based on a biological imperative would lead to that evolutionary, the benefit of the species, or whatever we might say, the end or the telos of the biological imperative is. You're saying that there are some cases where that's still wrong. Am I misunderstanding you?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah. It sounds like what you're saying is there are some examples where your argument, the biological grounding for objective morality, there are some examples where maybe that's not the case, or at least it doesn't inform us properly because we might take wrong action based on what we think the biological imperative is. And that maybe there is no way of properly knowing what it is or what the right action according to which it is. Your argument seems to be that whether or not we could use this moral heuristic 100% of the time or not, and perhaps we can't use it 100% of the time, it is the best heuristic we have.
I don't know if that's what I was saying, but I think I would agree with that statement. I think we might have reached loggerheads on this issue.
Okay.
Because I feel like at the end.
Oh, I was just going to say we've about reached the kind of the hour mark. So before we go into closing statements, I wanted to ask this kind of last couple questions. They're all from Dorgoon, and Dorgoon says, do people have obligations to maintain social traditions? In other words, if social traditions are presumably some kind of evolved trait, do they, and kind of if being an evolved social trait is what makes something moral, do social traditions have some level of moral worth?
No, I would say not inherently. No, okay. I think that we should preserve a tradition in as far as it conforms to that goal of maximizing human flourishing. But tradition in itself, to me, is not a value necessarily worth preserving in itself.
Okay.
What's your take on that?
Well, I think something you said there, and I think you might have said it earlier and I missed it. But it seems you're moving to kind of a maximizing human flourishing, and I can see how you could argue that maximizing human flourishing does come from kind of evolution, but I guess my question there is, would you say that there are perhaps some actions that might be biologically imperative that wouldn't lead to greater human flourishing in the long run?
I don't know what those would be. I'm sure if we had more time, we could, be imaginative and come up with some. But at the moment, no, I'm coming up short on that.
Okay. Yeah. I want to go into closing statements, if that's all right with you.
Go ahead.
If you had any question for me, or
I have a few actually, and I'm sorry I didn't ask these earlier. I just didn't know if there was like an opportune window in the discussion to ask those questions. But now anyway.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. I guess I kept rapid firing them at you, but
yeah, it's okay. Well, listen, you said earlier that you delineated between kind of a prescriptive and a descriptive morality, and you described my position as well, morality is descriptive. We treat each other as though we have human worth, and therefore we have human worth. I wouldn't say I fully agree with that, but I would say that I do view moral actions, or rather the judgment of moral good and evil, as byproducts of human action. And I would say that they don't make sense unless the abstract concepts of good and evil don't exist unless in reference to these actions. So my question to you is, to you, I assume good and evil are prescriptive, but what would that mean in an abstract sense? Like, what would we classify? How would we define those terms, good and evil, without reference to human action?
Well, I'm not sure we could define them outside of human action. There would be some reference to human action, but it wouldn't be kind of in a descriptive way. In other words, it wouldn't be, these are actions that we've seen have led to human flourishing, for example. What we would say is that a certain human action does this to a human person. And it's the fact of that action, regardless of its effects, that makes it good or evil. An example here might be contraception. If you have an understanding of human nature and the way human nature interacts with the universe, contraception from a consequential worldview might be acceptable under whatever circumstances, but from kind of a prescriptive perspective, it would be wrong, because it's not in accord with our human nature. It's almost a kind of a contradictory way of thinking, looking at it, as in, going into the sexual act with the reproductive act with the intent of not reproducing.
So, I mean, if that's your, I guess if that's your framework for moral reasoning, then what am I trying to say here? I mean, is your first principle of moral reasoning that which aligns with human nature as it interacts with the universe?
Basically, yeah.
Okay.
In other words, human beings were created in a particular way, in which they flourish if they act in a certain way, and they don't flourish if they don't act in that way, or act contrary to that way. And so as long as we consider a human being a particular thing with a particular way of being, then we can understand right and wrong that way.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because, and you'll have to forgive me if I'm misrepresenting this assertion, because, obviously I'm not a practicing Christian, and all my knowledge of the Bible comes from biblical scholars. But, in Paul's letter to the Romans, he says that, humanity has a sinful nature and that we're born into sin, and it's only through the power of God's grace that we can that we can have recourse to act in a moral way or according to God's will or God's commandment. So what, given that previous statement, what's your take on that? How much stock do you put in that book? Because where I come from, which is the American South, most Christians are Protestants, and the Book of Romans is such a cornerstone of that denomination. And admittedly, I know very little of Catholicism. So what's your take on that?
Sure. What Paul is talking about is, at the way Catholics understand it, is the effect of original sin. And perhaps a Protestant way of looking at original sin is that, because this thing happened, the original sin, whatever that thing was, that created kind of a debt to God that had to be repaid to him through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. And there might be some stock in that theological line of reasoning. But what I think is more helpful is that what original sin did was it fractured our nature in such a way. In other words, human beings were created good, but our nature was distorted in a way. And he goes on to say, Paul goes on to say that some of the things I want to do, or I want to do the things I know are wrong, and the things that I know are right, I don't do them. And that's kind of talking about the effect of what that distorted nature does. We have emotions, and emotions are good, but they've been distorted. Our emotions don't always lead us to the good. They're limited, and so we need the grace of God, aided by our own reasoning, to kind of separate what is our original nature and our reformed nature in Jesus Christ, and what is that fractured nature telling us.
Interesting. Okay. I'd never heard that perspective before, so thank you for elucidating that.
No problem.
I think that's all I've got for you. So.
Okay. Is there anything you want to say in closing?
I was gonna let you. I mean, if you would like me to go first, then I'm more than happy to do so.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. I think that we had. I think the biggest disconnect here was really kind of the starting premise of this conversation, which was that I had to prove that that humans have intrinsic worth, and that I had to demonstrate this without God. And to be quite honest, I feel like I might have failed to do so adequately. I still sincerely hold onto my perspective on human morality, and that we can kind of be informed of the worth of human beings just through our own lived experience and our own evolved nature. But I think that perhaps if we'd had more time, we could have unpacked that kind of issue a little bit more, and that's more or less what I have to say in closing.
All right. And first of all, I want to thank Reality Weasel for coming on. You can find a link to his channel in the chat, in the description, and also to his Twitter. I thought he defended his position very well in this discussion, and what struck me was kind of the depth of the position you brought. It wasn't simply that evolution causes us to be a certain way and therefore we ought to be that way. It's rather that there is a human nature that a human nature that is kind of an emergent property of evolution that is derived from it and yet somewhat separated from it, if I understood your position correctly. And this kind of understanding, though it's one that I disagree with, is one that perhaps can be said to have more depth than many people who would hold to your position of objective morality being able to be justified in evolution. So I learned a lot about that perspective through this discussion. So I want to thank everyone who watched, everyone who participated in the chat. There were a lot of good questions we were able to ask. Remember to check out the resources in the description. And if you enjoyed this discussion, give this video a like. And I also want to say that, like Reality Weasel said, if we had more time, we could have gone more in depth, and I'd like to do that in the future. So Reality Weasel, if you'd like to come on another time, I'd be happy to have you.
I'd love to do that.
So have a good night, everyone, and go with God.
All right. Thanks so much.